I wanted to ask you, because there's something in First Nephi that does cause people's faith sometimes. They can't really square the circle of what happens, and that's with Nephi having to slay Laban. Well, what are your thoughts on this, and what advice would you give to someone who looks at that and says, I don't know, that's a stumbling block for me, you know?
Yeah, I get it. That's obviously really hard, right? We come from a world that's not just that our values are different, but in a lot of ways, especially us in the modern world, we're really kind of insulated from death a lot, right? When people you love die, it's usually, it's not. I do understand there are tragedies and accidents happen, and lots of people do have to deal with really tragic, even gruesome deaths of family members and things like that. But for the most part, if you live in the developed world, your family members die at an old age in a nursing home, or peacefully in their sleep, or in a hospital or something like that, and in these kind of sterile, clean environments where we've kind of put death at a distance. And so I think a part of our wrestle there is death itself is not something we confront well in our society today, or that we have to confront often. And I mean, even like the last, World War II was in the 1940s, right? And so my grandfather was a World War II veteran. So for a lot of people, their grandparents, or maybe their great-grandparents now, because there's, younger generations coming up, they knew war, but a lot of us don't actually know war. We don't actually confront violence like that on that level directly. And so I think a big part of our struggle with this is not just that our values have changed, but our exposure and our experience with death and war and things like that is different. And that's all a good thing. I think it's obviously a testament to how much better the world has gotten, and that's good. But the ancient world is so different. It is so, so different. And death is something that pretty intimately and pretty firsthand if you're living in an ancient city, if you're living in an ancient world. You've probably had, Sariah has, we know, 4 sons and an unnamed number of daughters, plus she has 2 more sons. And that seems large, but it's not totally out of the ordinary for ancient times. She probably had several children or some additional children in between those that would have died in infancy. There were wars happening all the time in the ancient world. The big empires like Assyria and Babylon, they kind of made it a business every summer to just march out to war and conquer somebody. That was kind of what they did. And, Lehi and Nephi, they're in this setting where the year the Book of Mormon starts, right, is the first year of the reign of Zedekiah. Well, Zedekiah is appointed by the Babylonian king after he laid siege to Jerusalem. And so they witnessed wartime siege pretty recently, which would have involved a lot. If you look at the accounts in like Jeremiah and stuff about not this specific siege, but the siege that happens 10 years later, and you look at the accounts in 2 Kings and stuff about like what's going on when a city's under siege and people are starving to death. And I can't remember what the passage is in the Old Testament, but there's a story about like women who have to make really hard choices about like, and I'm sorry, this is gruesome, but this is in the Old Testament, like about which of their sons they're gonna like kill and eat because they're sick and they're dying. And it's gruesome. And I guess this is probably isn't comforting for anybody right now, but I think it's important to understand that Nephi lives in a really different world, right? And death and stuff like that, it's happening all around him. And this is kind of what's happening among the Israelites at the time. And one piece of advice, I feel like we struggle a lot with Laban, but if you read the Old Testament, there's a lot of violence in there, right? And there's a lot of gruesome things that are going on in ancient Israel. And some of it is being attributed to the commands of God. And I wrestle, personally, I wrestle a lot more with some of the violence I see in the Old Testament and what to do with that than I do with Laban and Nephi. But that's probably not very helpful because it's just creating a bigger problem for people. Let me
No.
back that up a little bit, because the other thing you have to understand about this is, like I said, so Assyria and Babylon and these major empires, they're marching out to conquest cities all the time. And when they do it under the banner of their God, right? And their, you know, in their worldview, their ideology, their religion, right? Their God is going to help them conquer the world. And they're coming to conquer you and destroy you, and their God is going to help you do it. And if you're a little state like Israel or Judah, you know, and you're a city like Jerusalem that's coming to be conquered, what you need is confidence in your own God, right? That he can be a warrior and a protector. And so that's part of this Israelite ideology, this Israelite mentality, is that God himself is a warrior, and he's fierce and he's strong, and he can actually he can help our armies and help our people protect ourselves from these armies that are coming to conquest, right? And you know, when they fail and they get conquered, the scriptures explain it as the Lord wasn't with you because you weren't righteous and you weren't repenting and things like that, right? It's if they do get conquered, it's not because the other people's God is stronger than our God. It's because our God wants to punish us because of what we're doing, right? And again, this is I think this is all stuff you have to understand about the Israelite conception of who God is, the Israelite understanding of the kinds of experiences an Israelite is having around this time, the martial, the militaristic kinds of experiences and things they would have been exposed to. So you just have to understand this is a really different world. And Hugh Nibley actually used to talk about how he would get students in his classes. He was a professor at BYU in like the 1950s, okay? And lo and behold, he gets these students from his classes, the Arab students who are coming from the Middle East, and he's having to read the Book of Mormon with them because that's what he's a professor of, and students had to take a religion class. And these Jordanian Arabs are reading the account of First Nephi, and they have a different problem with it. They look at it and they say, why is Nephi hesitating so much?
Yeah.
They think it's just perfectly natural to kill a guy in that situation. Now, again, it speaks to we have to try and take off our modern and Western values and views as we read this text and understand it from a different perspective. But okay, I don't know if any of that's helpful. Let me now start in what I think. Let me start with something that I think will be a little more helpful. I think we have to read this account very carefully because there's a lot of things going on. And when you understand more about the Israelite context, you also understand a little bit more about what Nephi is doing in this account. So first, there's okay. So let's just you have to go through all of the visits that they have with Laban and what happens, right? The very first thing is Laman, right, goes into Laban and asks for the plates. Laban accuses him of being a robber, and Laman runs. So a robber in an ancient context is not just like someone who steals stuff, but it's specifically like an outlaw. Think of like, so maybe a British perspective. Think of like Robin Hood, right? I don't know how.
Oh yeah.
You know, I was a big Robin Hood fan growing up as a kid. I love Robin Hood, right? But it's a robber is an outlaw. It's a band of outlaws, right, who antagonize the state. And ancient laws were such that someone who was a robber could basically be killed without due process of any kind, without a trial. And so when Laban accuses Laman of being a robber, he's basically accusing him of a capital offense for which he doesn't even have to be tried. And it's a false accusation. Laman doesn't try to steal the plates. He's asking for the plates, right? And Nephi comes up with this plan for their next attempt to get the plates. He says, okay, he thinks we're robbers. Let's go get all our gold and our silver and our precious things. Let's actually try to buy the plates. Let's show him that we're willing to honestly try to bargain with him to obtain the plates. Well, what does Laban do? He seizes all their property and he commissions his soldiers to go after them. And when he does that, he's not only now has he falsely accused the brothers of being robbers, but he's commissioned people to kill them, for one thing. He's commissioned his soldiers to kill them, and he has literally stolen their property. So now he's actually the one who's committed robbery, right? Armed robbery in a rather literal sense, because he's sent armed soldiers to kill them in the process. And in Israelite law, if you made a false accusation against somebody, you were then worthy of the punishment that offense was, that was affixed to that offense.
Sort of an eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth kind of thing.
So the idea is if you accuse somebody of a crime and it turns out your accusation is false, your motive for doing that is you want them to suffer a particular punishment. And so because that's what you were trying to do to them, instead you have to suffer that punishment. And so Laban has falsely accused the brothers of being robbers and commissioned them to death under a false accusation. And now he has literally committed that very crime. And so he's guilty of the capital punishment that he's sentenced them to on 2 counts: making the false accusation that they're robbers, and then being a robber himself and abusing his institutional power, if you will, because he's some kind of official in Jerusalem, and he abuses that to enrich himself and line his own pockets with their money, and sends them out to be killed in the process. When you have that buildup, that lead up in that context, it kind of baffles me today that we don't, like, in a time when it's all about we're all about putting emphasis on the marginalized and the disenfranchised and the unempowered. We don't see the power dynamic here. Like, Laban is an establishment. He has all the power in this relationship, if you will. Nephi and Laman have been marginalized and accused of being outcasts, of outlaws, right? And basically sentenced to death by a false accusation. And in a lot of ways, this story is the Lord helping the marginalized triumph over those who wield power. I don't understand why in today's society we can't actually find that a very empowering narrative. But when Nephi goes in to get the plates the last time, right, and he's told that the Lord will deliver Laban into his hands. Well, that's a specific phrase that shows up in Exodus 21 or 20, I think. There's actually a paper. John W. Welch, who, like I said, is my boss here at Book of Mormon Central, he wrote a paper on the legal context of Nephi slaying Laban. And he talks about how there's literally a phrase in Exodus 20. It's talking about the punishments that go to someone for slaying somebody. And it says there's a caveat, there's an exception. If the person does not lie in wait, but the Lord delivers them into your hands, then you will be given a safe haven. You will be given a place to flee and will not be considered guilty of homicide, basically, in Israelite law, under the law of Moses.
That's interesting.
And Nephi goes to pains in this account to make it clear he's not lying in wait. He tells us he went not knowing beforehand what he should do. He's clear to tell us he's not going out there to try and kill Laban, but the Lord delivers him into his hands. And so I think when we, again, if we step back, we just understand first of all, that this is a very different world. People have a very different worldview around death and killing and things like that than what we have today. And again, I'm not saying that's right. It's wonderful that we've progressed beyond that. That's important to understand. But the people in Scripture are products of their world, and they're shaped by the world they live in. So we have to understand that. But then we also look closely at the account, and we see that Nephi has laid the groundwork to basically demonstrate Laban. Laban is what's happening is Laban has proven himself guilty of a capital crime. He has gone not intending to kill him, not lying in wait to kill him, but then having him delivered into the Lord's hands. This is, under Israelite law, a justified killing, right? And this is something that would have been seen as acceptable. And what does he do? He then flees, right? The Lord gives him a place to flee out into the wilderness. And so I think when that may not settle it for everyone. I know, like, these are moral questions that are really hard to wrestle with, and I'm not.
Yeah.
I don't want to underplay that. I know this may not put everyone at ease over the issue, but I think when we understand what's going on and we understand that historical, cultural, even legal context, I think we can better see, like, Laban. First of all, at the very least, Laban's not a victim, right? He's not some innocent victim. He's actually, he's arguably, like I said, guilty of a capital crime. And there's some political stuff going on there too. I think that Nephi is, so this is really got to back up, but move forward. Then back up. But in 2 Nephi 5, Nephi tells us that he's starting to, like, it's in 2 Nephi 5, after Nephi has established a people separate from Laman and Lemuel, right? That he tells us, hey, I'm going to start this new record on small plates. And this record I'm writing, this is when I start it. So Nephi starts his record after he's trying to start a new people, and his people have want him to be king. And Noel Reynolds, I mentioned him earlier, he's done a lot of work showing that what Nephi's doing throughout 1 Nephi and into 2 Nephi is he's establishing his legitimacy as a ruler, right? And as a king. And part of what we have to understand is, from an ancient Near Eastern perspective, a ruler has to have kind of this warrior ethos, right? They've got to have, I mean, like I was talking about, you've got these major empires that are going to come out to war pretty much every year. And if you don't have a king that you feel confident can lead you in battle, you're not in a, your own safety's at risk, right? And so,
better to be a warrior in the garden than a gardener on the battlefield.
Right. It's, and so what you need, so in all kinds of ancient Near Eastern narratives where they're establishing the legitimacy of a king, there's almost always some kind of martial conflict, military conflict, victory that's part of their narrative in order to establish that, hey, I'm a legitimate king. And so part of what's going on is Nephi has to establish that he himself can be a warrior. And that's part of what he's trying to establish here with this encounter with Laban. And that legal context, he's trying to show that he can also be a just ruler, right? He's not meting out vengeance, right? He's meting out justice, right? He has been able to, he's confronted Laban. He's been found guilty of these capital crimes, and Nephi has been able to come up against this powerful figure and conquer. And that's part of what Nephi is trying to do. And again, I know we get it all wrapped up in our own values, in our own society, but I just find it so much more interesting to read from this ancient perspective, and from this ancient context. And when we do that, we understand what, it becomes more understandable what Nephi's doing, I think. And at least for me, that makes it easier to accept and come to terms with.